So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us in session B. This is Building Housing Community Power Through Narrative. And this panel is going to highlight ways that we come together to support housing reform by leveraging the power of narrative and storytelling. We will discuss ways to build long-lasting public support for housing strategies that center equity. And speaking as a Partnership for the Bay's Future Fellow, it's clear on the ground that narrative battles are at the heart of moving forward anti-displacement policies that create a more equitable region and are core to building the community power that will make those policy changes possible. Aisha in the last session just spoke to the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act here in Berkeley. I know with TOPA, there are certainly competing narratives about what the policy will create for our communities, and a good chunk of fear and misinformation in the mix, with a strong coalition working to reframe the conversation in visionary ways. And I am so excited today to be able to hear from two brilliant panelists who help us see how narrative is in everything we do and how we can shift narratives towards racial equity and housing justice. In the interest of time, since the conversation portion of this session is just 30 minutes, I'm not going to share bios, but note that those bios, the links will be dropped in the chat. And also in the interest of time, there's no Q&A, but you can send us chats and we can try to weave things in as possible. So our panelists here today are RyanNicole and Dr. Tiffany Manuel, or Dr.T. And I'm actually going to hand it over to Dr. T first to ground us with what do we mean when we say narrative?
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. So narrative is the compilation of stories that we tell over and over and over again, right? That we tell consistently in our culture, so much so that they become the structure of how we think about what is possible. So all those every conversation that you have with your friends, your neighbors, I mean, even the small conversations you think that you're having are building a sense of possibility and hope, or they could be doing the opposite, right? Reinforcing the idea that we are powerless. They could be taking our power away. They could be reinforcing the idea that we don't, right, have the opportunity to change the future in front of us. So what I'm talking about is really the important power of narrative to shape our direction. And that's why this conversation right here is so important. We need to get really present to the stories we're telling, right? And what we are communicating, not just about the who and the what and the noun and the verb and all the things that we string together to tell a story, but what do those things powerfully communicate about who we are and what's possible? And so that's why this conversation is particularly relevant at this moment.
Amazing. Okay, so with that foundation and what narrative is, I want to also ground us in this moment, this unique moment. So let's speak to the power of the current moment. What are the opportunities that you are both seeing in your respective bodies of work to shift the narrative towards housing justice right now?
Well, thanks for asking the question. Thank you for having this session today. The power of the current moment. Right now, we're seeing API hate scenarios. We're seeing racial justice issues, and we're seeing housing justice issues. Right now, I'm finding that in the artist community, it's really easy to connect those three conversations, quite frankly, with actually what's happening with the pandemic. All of these things are correlated. They're all scenarios and situations that are being discussed as a circumstance of, the dominant narrative, the dominant cultural landscape, white supremacy, the dominance of capitalism and overwrought capitalism, plaguing, working class peoples, plaguing peoples of color. And there's real opportunity there to talk about all of the sub-issues that fall from that, which is housing, which is healthcare access, economic opportunity, so on and so forth. And so I actually see, these problems that we're experiencing as products of a broader circumstance, but real opportunities to have pointed conversations about the scenarios that impact all of us. And I see that artists are definitely seizing the time and seizing the narrative to find linkages in those issues.
How about you, Dr. T?
Yeah, I would just echo, Ryan, everything you just said, just about the power of the moment. And what I love about what you said, Ryan, was I think for lots of us in the housing space and in these serious sectors of social change, Like we can get so kind of dour about the description that we're having about when we think about the opportunity, that it takes the joy out of what we're doing, right? And who wants to join, right, a conversation that makes them feel like right? And so I think what the sort of artistry and artists allow us to do is to think, to imagine outside of the sort of traditional box of how we communicate about these really serious social issues, and give us a kind of freedom, right, that I'm sure Ryan can speak to certainly more than I can. But I just think that there is a lot of power in this moment. I see it a lot of just in terms of the kinds of new partnerships on the ground, people who are finding their way to each other out of necessity, not because they decided that, like this was the moment for us to sit down and have a conversation, but because there really wasn't another option, right? And so I think in that kind of moment, there's all kinds of possibilities for reshaping our conversations, because we are having conversations we haven't had in the past. I would just also say in moments like this where everything around us feels like it's in crisis, people are more willing to be just a little bit more reflective. And even I would say there are two directions. Either people get really nervous and afraid and they start to cower and they start to try and hold on to what they have, right? And you see some folks doing this, right? Right, trying to figure out how to keep, every little bit of what they have from other people who are trying to take their stuff, or they get really thoughtful about how do we help, how do we open up. And so I would say that our narratives, every story that we tell, everything that we say should be helping people to open up in this moment, right, to help us figure out how to be in the service of each other, rather than doing this, which is being selfish, trying to figure out how to preserve me and my family and mine, and just trying to figure out how to get myself to safety. We all know that they always say when you're on a plane, like when put your own face mask on first. There's nothing wrong with making sure that you have what you need, but there is something that is so empowering about us opening up. And so every conversation that you have with somebody, you should be thinking, how is this opening people up to the power of what we have together versus what I'm trying to hold on for myself?
Indeed.
That is beautiful. And I think you all kind of somewhat answered our next question, but I just want to hear more about, this is right in the title. How do you build the inherent power to do this work? How are we building narrative power in the Bay Area? Who are the organizations working to build narrative power in the area and equip folks with a set of messages and tools to do this? What does it look like when we get those messages out? I don't know who wants to take that first. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll start, and then no, Dr. T will knock it out of the park for me once I get on base. But I believe, the first thing that we need to do is to find commonality in the struggle, like find commonality. And of course, in this scenario, we're talking about struggle, we're talking about dire consequences and situations, but we have to find commonality in our experiences, whether they're positive or negative. One way that we certainly talk about uh, meeting on the same page as we talk about food. We talk about things that are relational. We talk about family. We connect from the places that all of us are experiencing. And so I think, the first way to begin to get people to see their commonality is to, or excuse me, see their opportunity to fight together in this struggle is to find commonality in things that they just relate to. I think the other thing is to show that well, again, there's no dissimilarity in our experiences. There's an organization that's doing this work really wonderfully well, which is the Black Cultural Zone here in East Oakland. Black Cultural Zone is an 8-year coalition or collaboration of 50 plus organizations, faith-based leaders, community leaders, and artists and culture makers here in Oakland. And I want to underscore that they led with culture first. They understood that arts and culture was the way to galvanize people, to again discuss food, to discuss the things that make us happy and joyous. But their main objective was to assure that Black people were able to stay in Oakland. They made sure that they made their issue simple enough for everybody to connect to. They made the hook appealing enough for folks to want to be around, come to an event, come to a party, come to a block party, let's break bread together. And then they provided information. And so what you see now, 8 years down the line, is land acquisition from this coalition of community residents. You see health and wellness access in ways that you haven't seen it before. And you see engagement around placement and rematriation of the land in a way that you haven't seen in East Oakland. And that is the way that they've been combating displacement that I think has been extremely successful. But again, they began from a place of accessibility, and they began from a place of joy.
Joy coming up again and again. Yeah, Dr. T, what about you? How do we build the inherent power to do this work?
I was gonna say, yeah, I just love, I think as many, we should say joy as many times we possibly can in this conversation. I think that is, so important to the spirit that we need to bring to this work. But I would just again echo what you just talked about, Ryan, just in terms of and I think about what you said, it's really like that early trust building is really key and important. And what I'm really excited about is what I have seen in the Bay Area, working with a lot of groups over a number of years, is a lot of that trust building work and the importance of that. Narrative power can only be built if we trust each other. Like if I don't trust you, I don't really care what narrative you listen. You can sing to it, dance to it, but I don't really care. If I don't trust you, we don't really have a conversation that's going to be about us working together. Don't do it. And so that trust building is what I've seen developing in the Bay Area. And it really is, I work all over the country. It really is an extraordinary part of the experience of being in the Bay Area that I don't know that folks fully appreciate, right? Unless and until you go to other places and you're like, wait a minute, y'all don't even talk to each other? Right? Y'all don't have the kind of relationships across these various, organizations and agencies and public agencies, and also even some small businesses that you see in the area. And so that trust building is the foundation, right, of any kind of narrative change work that you're going to be able to do. And it's the reason why I think you're starting to see so much really good narrative shift work happening. I think a lot of the work that some of the folks I work with, like Chan Zuckerberg folks, are doing a lot of the learning labs to get people in a room to start talking about what it means to change and shift narrative. Certainly, we're doing some work with the tipping point community. Same thing, really being thoughtful and trying to think about how we shift the narrative on poverty and homelessness. And I would say that the majority of work we've done in the Bay Area has really been with NPH, Nonprofit Housing Association, and a wider range of coalition partners that they have been able to pull together over a number of years to really do the hard thinking. What are the narratives that need to be unseated? If we are to begin building narrative power, how do we get tools in the hands of folks locally about just some common language that folks can begin to use together that will help us talk about these issues in some kind of united way. We don't all have to check the box that we agree on every single policy issue or check the box that we're advocating for the exact same things, but our conversation and the stories that we're telling, right, should start to converge in a particular direction. And so I just see, based on the level of trust that the organizations in the Bay Area have been developing over a number of years, you're starting to see that coalesce around just some basic parts of a narrative that tell a very different story that is going to pay off, right? Paying off in terms of how people think about housing and what is possible in terms of housing justice.
Thank you. This conversation has me thinking about Adrienne Maree Brown, because we're talking so much about joy and pleasure activism. And when I heard you, RyanNicole, talk about Black Cultural Zone, and they're starting with block parties and all of this community building, 8 years down the line, they're doing land acquisition, health and wellness. That it reminds me of one of her quotes, "Move at the speed of trust," coming up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, saying that's big. That is critical.
Yeah. So I think with the next couple of questions, I want to just drill down a little bit more into what this can look like on the ground. And RyanNicole, really starting with you on what is the role of multimedia and the arts in this narrative work. We can talk about words for narrative, but we'd be missing a huge part of it if we don't talk about all different kinds of mediums. And so, what are the partnerships you want to see and are already a part of or already seeing when it comes to partnerships between different artistic mediums?
Well, let's talk about multimedia really quickly. We spend so much time on our phones in front of a device, watching television, listening to the radio, listening to a podcast, reading a book or an article somewhere. God, I don't even know if people read actual physical books anymore, but reading some form of media, and all of that is informing the messaging that it's the messaging we're ingesting, and then it becomes the messaging that we're then putting back out into the world, informing our belief system. So multimedia, I think, is critical in terms of defining our belief systems, or at least influencing our belief systems. And so multimedia has a major role to play in shifting the narrative. uh, what I find is, we must be strong gatekeepers around the types of language and messaging that we're putting into and putting into our bodies, um, and allowing to come back out of our bodies. But we have to be, as a coalition, as a group of activists and change makers, have to be people who are seeing multimedia as a space where we are putting our energy and our focus. Uh, there are some really great examples of narrative change work in popular culture multimedia releases. Right here out of the Bay Area, we've seen The North Pole, which is a TV show about displacement and gentrification based in North Oakland. It also talks about climate change, and racial justice issues, and just kind of the nexus of issues that working class people face here in the Bay Area. Another great show, I think, is Gentefied, that also talks about displacement, talks about it from a Latinx perspective in LA. And another example is Blind Spotting and the Haven Project, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit more. Um, I think the goal is really to get folks who know this work into writing rooms, into coalition and partnership with culture makers and culture creators. And there are some really interesting, fascinating partnerships that are happening right now, and they've been happening for like the last 2 or 3 years, in multimedia spaces that are reaching our our bright and shining spaces. They're getting Oscars, they're winning Grammys, they're winning the Tonys, so on and so forth. And they're breaking barriers in radio and media. And so I think, again, media is just a really critical place, because these are the messages that, whether or not we're entirely conscious of it, these are the messages that we're hearing over and over, the messages that we begin to repeat like a mantra, and the belief systems that we create and concretize watching and ingesting media. So it is critical that, again, people who are working in justice spaces are also finding themselves in spaces like writer's room, or finding ways to insert themselves in the production spaces of media.
Yeah, and if I can chime in on that one, I would say I think that's exactly right. And the way I think about it is from the vantage point of the sort of, I call it the old lady voice. I'm an old lady now. I'm reminded of that every time I talk to my children and there's some new device or some new thing they're on, and I'm just trying to decipher what the heck is happening here. But the way I think about that is, especially for, the old lady voices in the room, I recognize that we have to be on multiple platforms, because if we don't vary the media that we use, we won't have the ability to influence young people. That is the way they communicate with each other. That is the way they learn, right? That is the way that they consume and digest and share information. And so much of that, Ryan, to your point, is so much of that learning is unconscious. It's not like they're sitting down to like, now I have to learn how to do my, they're ingesting in a way that is sometimes a little frightening, honestly, because it is so unconscious. But it is the way, right? If our goal is to bring more young people into the circle of our advocacy and our mobilizing, we have to be on those platforms. My two younger sons, I try to keep up with them and figure out like what's the next thing. And of course, TikTok is the thing. And I'm like, what are you doing? Are you TikToking over there? I'm looking at their platform to figure out what they're doing. And for the life of me, I can't understand why like that thing is so mesmerizing to them. But it is. And they pick up so much. And they actually talk to me about lots of political things based on these crazy little like videos that are to me just hours of nothingness. So what I would say for us is, let's number one, let's make sure that we are hiring people across the age distribution, especially young folks who know how to move in different kinds of multimedia circles. But it also means let's be open to what it means to influence folks using a wider variety of modalities and mediums than we have before. Even if you don't understand it, if you're the old lady person like me who's like, what, right? Recognize that learning is taking places in very different ways. So there you go.
Yeah. I'm not on TikTok, but I respect TikTok. I think the moment that really started was, I think it was on TikTok that so many teens organized to buy up tickets to a Trump rally and then not show up and then have this empty stadium. You know, there's a lot of organizing happening on TikTok.
Right.
Or,
And a couple of weeks ago, they organized to like take over a couple major stocks and stock with GameStop and a couple other
right.
ones.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And I'm like, what is happening? These kids are taking over the stock market. Like,
Yeah.
Right.
off of TikTok.
Off of TikTok and Reddit. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Or I think about how AOC, Alexandra
Mm-hmm.
Ocasio-Cortez, uses Instagram, you know,
Mhm.
you see like hundreds of thousands of people on her live breaking down, you know, the new stimulus or whatever the case may be. And it's like, this is where it's at, you know.
I mean, one really great example of that is Bernie Sanders talking to Cardi B about,
Uh-huh.
about his election. She has 10,000 more, 10 times, more followers than he has. And he knows that, reaching that community is only going to happen through somebody like her, a social influencer like her. I also want to mention there's a article in Washington Post that just came out, I think today, if not yesterday, about corporations, getting in front of basically being canceled, getting in front of cancel culture and utilizing social influencers, artists, social media, so on and so forth. We need to be, if not lockstep with what the corporations are doing, we need to be, steps ahead of what they're doing and engaging again different types of coalitions and working on these different mediums.
Yeah, can I riff on that just for a second? I love that because I think just not just thinking about corporations, but I think the one thing that I think all of this sort of social media stuff does is it really democratizes the opportunity to get in front of folks. It
Yeah.
used to be that there were, again, old lady voice. When I was younger, there were 3 channels on the TV that were major networks, and the news, right, came on at a certain time of day, right, and was given to you by like Barbara Walters and Dan Rand. Like there were 3 guys, one gal maybe, who gave you the news, and that was the official story. And today, that is just not the case. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that the world has changed in terms of where information comes from, and that just gives us so much more opportunity to get our messaging and our narratives out in a different way. That I think 15, 20 years ago, we were hamstrung trying to figure out how to get these journalists to tell different stories. Well, you don't need these journalists to tell the stories you're trying to. You can get those stories out right by yourself through all these different kinds of social media platforms. And so that has a democratizing effect if we use it very thoughtfully.
Yeah.
The opportunity to compete with some of these corporations. Like, listen, folks, you don't own the only channel, right, of communicating about these issues. And so, to the extent that we are using it thoughtfully, we have those opportunities to really engage differently than I think we have in the past.
Indeed.
Yeah, that is a great segue in the sense that you kept hammering on, to the extent that we're using it thoughtfully, right? And so we're democratizing our chance to get our messages out, right? For racial equity, for social justice, and there's many more channels to get misinformation out, right? And maybe we'll just spend a couple minutes on this one because, this has been a joyful conversation. I don't want to be the negative Nancy, but I do want to hear from you a little bit before we turn to a closing question, Dr. T, on some of the nitty gritty of how do you correct misinformation without falling trapped to parroting it? What do you do when the language of your goals is co-opted in bad faith? How much should you focus on those efforts versus just consolidating your supportive base? And those questions are coming from a very timely place for some of us working on the TOPA campaign in Berkeley.
Yeah. So those are excellent questions. And I would say those are two separate but related questions, one about misinformation and one about having people co-opt your message. on the misinformation, do you correct it? You asked the question, how do you correct it? I would say the question needs to be, do you need to correct it? And so you should ask yourself the question, right? Number one, do we need to respond to this, right? Sometimes there's misinformation that gets put out, but it's put out by, a small number of friends, folks who don't have very much of an audience, are not going to get very much traction that, and you would actually give them more airtime by responding to it than you do if you just let like the cuckoo birds go off and cuckoo, right? Right. So ask yourself, do we really need to respond? Is that likely to get any traction with any of the folks that we care about or that we are trying to get in front of? And if the answer is no, then let the cuckoo birds cuckoo, right? The other thing is, right, you got to ask yourself, does responding to this misinformation take us away or distract from the narrative that we're trying to put in place? So if somebody's trying to take you off on a tangent with misinformation that's only tangentially related to the message that you're trying to tell, even if it's misinformation, I would say avoid the inclination to go and correct it, because what will happen is you will correct that information but lose the broader battle, right? Because now they've moved you into a part of the side issue that's not even the thing you really want to talk about, right? And so if it's taking you away from that narrative, even if it gets a hearing, right? If it's taking away from the stuff you're talking about, let it go. But if you have to push back, right? If it's going to get more traction, then it really deserves or requires. If it's not likely to take you away from the stuff that you want to talk about, and you know that you're going to have to respond, do not parrot the information back, but pivot, right? And so a lot of times when I talk to folks, it is figure out the stuff of what they just said that you can agree with. I agree that we need to be very concerned about and then put the actual information back out. So you're not parroting somebody else's information. You're saying, I agree, we all need to be really concerned about how much, right, the distribution of taxes in our region. Absolutely. That's why I'm so concerned about that. And then you go off and give the correct information. So you've been able to get the right information out in the way that you want to do it without having to parrot that information. The second thing, though, what you asked about was really important too. You asked about co-optation and the extent to which the folks are taking, and you see folks will take this, yes, this is about justice in America, and then they'll go off and say something that is about voter suppression or something like that. And you're like, huh? How did you get from justice to voter suppression and link those two in your mind? So what I would say, if you're finding that people are co-opting your message, first of all, congratulations. Good for you. Because you force them now to play on your territory. Now they have to play on your turf, right? So whatever you've done, right, to shift the conversation, now your opposition has had to shift, right, to start parroting your message to try and get some traction. So first of all, pat yourselves on the back. Congratulations. What you're doing is working, right? Recognize, right, that now somebody else is in your message. And I would say the same too. I would say, like the old Forrest Gump movie, if you find yourself in that situation, run, Forrest, run. Right? Your message is working, and you are ultimately going to be better at that messaging than somebody else who's trying to parrot it for some other reason. So if an example that I gave, you're talking about justice and what it means to have housing justice or racial justice, and somebody starts talking about voter suppression, you've got more traction on that. You can really ask the question. I don't know how voter suppression is justice, but I can tell you what is. Here's what justice looks like to me. It's every single person being able to walk up to a polling place, get whatever they need in a timely manner. That's what justice means to me. And I'm so glad that we agree, right, that justice is on the table. So for that, I would say, it may not feel like it, but that is an enviable place to be when your opposition is trying to fight you on your own territory. You're ultimately in much better shape, right, than they are trying to fight you in your messaging.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm feeling a lot better, and I took a lot of good notes during that. Thank you so much. So I'm told we actually can go up until 11:45. So just to close us out, I want to hear from both of you what needs to change in the narrative regionally to drive people to action on housing justice. What does that action look like? What are some of the examples of narrative shift already underway that is leading to transformation in how policy gets made?
Mm-hmm.
I'll just start from my place. And again, Dr. T will knock it out of the park. But I think, mainly narrative has to be accessible. We have to start with a basic message. When you think about the work that Black Cultural Zone did, is doing, Black Cultural Zone started with a very basic goal and objective. They said, we're just trying to keep Black residents in Oakland. If we break that down as people who work in advocacy, folks who've been doing this work and are behind the desk 24/7, then we know that that means that there are people who are being pushed out. We know that that alludes to the fact that there are Black people in specific that have been pushed out. That means that we know that there are Black folks, that the numbers of Black folks are dwindling. But what that means to the lame person is simply, we just want to keep Oakland Black. That's something I think that a broad coalition can galvanize around. Your faith-based people, your young people, your elder people, your lower income, your upper income people, and everybody in between, business owners, so on and so forth. So I think that's first. You have to make the message accessible, I think, to as many people as possible without obviously diluting it. They didn't cater to or kowtow in their messaging. It's very Black, it's unapologetically Black, and it's unapologetically East Oakland. It's not about all of Oakland. It's not, they're very specific to their message. So I think it's that accessible. I also think that narrative has to be authentic. I think it should speak from a place of experience and not theory. I think you want to put people in front of your microphone. You want to make sure that the stories that are being shared are folks who are actually experiencing it. I think that way you galvanize a body of people who are also experiencing it. And those people who are not experiencing that situation are their empathy is triggered. So I think that's important. And then I mainly think that a real space of opportunity is to engage artists at the very beginning. So many advocacy organizations and engage broader coalitions of people from the very beginning. But the benefit of artistry, I think, is that like we said at the very beginning, we are a body of people who are experiencing housing insecurity. I think we're some of the first people who experience housing insecurity in cities first, and are pushed out and displaced first. So we know that experience firsthand. We're also able to communicate a message that maybe some of us who are in the work, who have to keep a job, to be quite frank, we don't have to be that careful. We can say the things that you don't want to say. We can have an unrestrained tongue in spaces where other people have to be a bit more conservative. And I think there's real benefit there. I just think there's real benefit there. So there's real power in engaging artists. There's real power in being accessible, and extreme power in making our narrative authentic.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. T.
I love that, and I would echo, especially what I love that Ryan went to accessible, authentic, based on people's experience. I love that. That is very consistent with the way I try to do my work and the way I try to think about issues of narrative overall. And I would just say, especially on that first one, just accessibility, right? So much of our sort of narrative about these serious issues like housing, because it is such some of it gets wonky very quickly. But I think really getting out of our own heads and speaking to folks in an app and just a real plain, what does this help us to do? Like when you lean into a conversation about housing justice, speak to the aspirations of the people you're talking to. What is it that you want? People, we did this work with the Shift the Narrative work in San Francisco. People spoke about very simple things. I just want to live in the Bay Area. I want to know that my children have a place here, right? Because right now I have a home or may have a place, but my kids can't afford to get anything. They can't afford to start their lives independently of us as parents. They can't afford to figure out their own way. And as a parent, I got to make sure my kids are okay. And right now, I'm not sure they will be. We were doing just some work recently on homelessness in the Bay Area, and folks talked about just the idea, like if folks said, it used to be that I could, on a Sunday afternoon, my wife and I could get a picnic basket and a blanket and head out to the park, and we could get the kids together and lay out and have a picnic in the middle of the park, and we could even go to sleep while the kids ran around. and then, have them come back and spend a whole day just, feeling free. And in the Bay Area, that is now an experience that a whole generation of kids will not have. It is really difficult to find a place where you can do that because of what's happening in homelessness and the encampments and stuff like that. I want to see a Bay Area. People told us this. I want to be in a Bay Area where you could have a Sunday afternoon picnic. I was like, it's really very simple. It's not right. I'm not asking for the moon and the stars. I just want to live in a place where, my God, I can have, I can go to outdoor restaurants and not be accosted. I want to live in a place where, right, all of these other things are possible, right? Where that reinforces my health and well-being, that reinforces my sense of pride about where I live. When you start to talk to people in that kind of accessible way, they get it, right? That's what pulls people forward. Like, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, I want to come to that meeting. Where's the meeting we go to where our kids get to, have a picnic in the park? Like, that's their experience. When you do that, that starts a very different conversation. I think more of those kind of conversations help to pull people forward. So to the extent that we're beginning to take all the wonky intellectualism that we have in our head and translate that into the experience of what people aspire to in the Bay Area, you get a different result. And we start to change people's hearts and minds in terms of how they think about issues of housing for everybody, not just for some folks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. T and RyanNicole. This was just a really rich conversation. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. Speaking for those of us that are involved in this initiative, it's such an amazing conversation at a point where we're pausing to reflect on where we've been and where we're going. And I know I'm carrying forward joy, trust, authenticity, and accessibility, and staying on your message, even if it's getting co-opted, just, being in your truth and your lane. So thank you so much. I know it's going to resonate too for the broader audiences here that are dedicated to housing justice and racial equity.
Thank you.